Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Cool. Hi everyone, I'm Samo Burja, and today I'll be talking about institutional reform of government. The usual way this is discussed is very narrow, it's very policy focused. Sometimes it's focused on concrete changes to literature or establishing the intellectual case for something. Other times it's framed in terms of electoral politics and electoral coalitions. I think both of these approaches are deeply flawed and not how the most meaningful change happens in government. I think that it's much less useful to think of government as a unitary object, as a unitary system, and more as a collection of interdependent systems, right? If we think of government as strictly unitary, then something like modern Britain makes no sense at all. It's a parliamentary democracy, yet it doesn't have a written constitution. It's clearly forming some sort of republican representative system, yet it's a crowned monarchy. It's a system where the elected officials, though, can't really fire anyone that's sufficiently senior in the civil service. So instead of thinking of modern Britain as a republic, a monarchy, a democracy, or a bureaucracy, it's best to think of the government as a bunch of layered systems, all on top of each other, with different bases of legitimacy and different modes of operation, stuff that's only very lightly touched by political theory, but mostly encoded in practice, mostly coded in precedent, and sometimes a little bit coded by the particular convenience of key politicians. If you think that it's all discourse, you might waste your time with policy papers. And if you think it's all politics, you might waste all your time boosting a particular politician and then being surprised when they necessarily don't do what they promise to do, because often what they promise to do is impossible, either personally, politically impossible, impossible for their wider coalition, or just impossible for the kind of organization that they've inherited. So thinking of government as several different institutions, as layers of social technology, clarifies how Britain can both have, a functioning dynasty in a way, with Queen Elizabeth being the representative of that dynasty, yet having democratic elements, yet fundamentally still being mostly dominated by the civil service as such. With the civil service itself not being necessarily even, overbearing or tyrannical as some narratives might propose, but just doing a very narrow job, like a narrow artificial intelligence or a piece of software. So this layering of social technologies proposes then that the best way to reform government is to produce a new government institution, or several, that operate on different principles than the existing institutions in government, yet are endorsed by the other institutions of government. So when you mix in multiple agencies into the same interacting system, different agencies come up on top. For example, it's an interesting question, and now I maybe look at a historical example at a more authoritarian system than what modern Britain is or what the modern US is. In the Soviet Union, the key political power struggle was between the Communist Party and the KGB. It was not between the Communist Party and the people, or even the Communist Party and the kulaks, right? The kulaks were scapegoats, they were wealthy farmers, but they obviously couldn't engage in industrial warfare even if they didn't like communism as such. So this key struggle happened because the KGB as such had the ability to keep secrets from the Communist Party as such, and in fact kept some secrets successfully. The KGB had an agreement with the East German Stasi to, in case of change in civilian government in East Germany, have the Stasi overthrow the East German government. Note, the East German civilian government was a communist government, right? Communist Party officials. But the party was organized along different lines than the KGB itself, even when the party used the KGB as their own instrument, right? One of the key notes here to consider is that, most of Stalin's foes were other Communist Party officials. So Stalin perhaps is best modeled as someone that is a tyrannical leader using an intelligence agency to subdue what otherwise would be a sort of like committee-based party bureaucracy. And if you look at China today, China's greatest threat, the greatest threat to the Chinese Communist Party is not some sort of Western style liberal democratic revolution. It will be a military coup from the People's Liberation Army, which means that they're incentivized in important ways to disrupt the People's Liberation Army, even while on the other hand, they're incentivized to make it very formidable and powerful in order to, say, challenge the US on the world stage, or more generously, provide for Chinese security and territorial integrity. So what I'm sketching out here is that if you interleave different systems, they will come into conflict with each other and sometimes route past each other. So when I say that you produce a new government institution that is accepted by current government institutions and has to be endorsed by them, I'm not saying compromise with them. It's possible to produce a government institution that, in terms of power or authority or influence, completely displaces the previous ones, either for the better or for the worse. And the key distinction between this and a revolution is that a revolution asserts that there is a new government. It makes the legal case that we are a distinct entity, a distinct system from the previous one. You can have what is a revolution in substance without ever having a revolution on paper. And that's one of the reasons why, while I feel that, say, political theory and written constitutions and all of these methods are valuable and useful, they ultimately are downstream from these institutional realities. The real Constitution of the United States changed massively once you added the FBI, or you added the IRS, or you added the Federal Reserve. And it's changed massively when the ministry, the Department of War and the Department of Peace, the State Department and what used to be called the Department of War, no longer shared a single building. Because if you have then the Pentagon and the State Department as two massive bureaucracies where people don't run into each other because they live in the same building and work in the same building, you can have a more schizophrenic foreign policy, where it's basically each one of these institutions is carrying out a slightly different international agenda, right? So something, even when the paper reality doesn't change as much, might still cause a massive policy shift decades down the line out of something as trivial as like changing the physical space where it's based. Okay, so this is very theoretical, it's very broad-based, but I wanted to share some of this basic theory and basic approach here, where it proposes that creating new institutions, completely new ones, is the best way to reform existing systems, and it's best to not propose a strong break with the old system, but still have the firm expectation of completely altering the old system. Cool, so would like to hear questions now.
Great. So most of you know the drill here. So if you want to ask a question, go ahead and put it in the chat, and then I will call your name and you can unmute yourself and ask your question. And just initially here, I'll start us off. So Samo, I'm wondering, in recent history in the United States, do you see that this kind of hidden revolution or shift of the guard has happened in any particular way that may be coming to light in this current crisis?
Well, I think in the 20th century, the US had several shifts and changes in what the system is, right? I think that obviously the New Deal is the most well-known one, right? Where FDR was president for life, though we didn't think of him as president for life, right? But when someone has 4 terms in office, it's the structural advantages to re-election just become overwhelming, right? So it's his health rather than any sort of failure to win an election that secured that position. I think that there was a massive shift in power towards US intelligence post-World War II. So I think that, this was stuff that was shown in the Church Committee papers in the 1970s, where, say, the role of the FBI went far into the domain of regulating political and social life. Wiretapping MLK, you wiretap MLK and you wiretap the KKK, it's not because you're picking a side, it's because your objective is a little bit amoral. Your objective is continued preservation of the system and stability, right? And then you wiretap them and you sometimes try to blackmail them, and you actively interfere in things that are relevant to shaping domestic politics. Other stuff like this is, say, Operation Mockingbird and so on. I do think the sense making of the intelligence agencies broke down over time, where the intelligence world of the early 2000s is in a way far less potent politically than the intelligence world of the 1960s. In fact, makes mistakes that it really shouldn't have made. I think another big change has been the empowerment of the presidency and the weakening of the president himself. Now, I'm not going to comment on Trump because he's a strange phenomenon, it's difficult to understand. But if we compare the power of the presidency, all of these extended bureaucracies around the White House in 2000 versus in 1950, in 2000, it's actually, I think, more powerful. But if we could compare President Eisenhower to, Bill Clinton, I think Eisenhower is more personally powerful, right? So there's an unacknowledged growth of a permanent executive in a way. Another thing is the weakening of Congress. Congress has, over the past 50 years, basically lost the ability to produce constitutional amendments. It's lost the ability to make committees or commissions that are more than just for show, but genuine oversight over other branches of government. There's finally also been a change in the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court seems to have evolved into a legislative organ. So in a way, the Supreme Court influences the substance of laws far more than Congress does at this point. Congress at this point is formalizing and putting in motion suggestions that were worked out outside of Congress, right? It's no longer a deliberative body. So in a way, it's very ceremonial, and I think we're starting to treat it as very ceremonial. This is why people get, so much more excited over presidential elections than they do over, congressional races. Was that sort of the question? Did I manage to answer the question in the way you were interested in, or?
Yeah, and I think just a follow up from that. So connected to what you're saying about reforming government institutions through the creation of adapting of current institutions to kind of like interweave and shift things over time. Do you see maybe, have you seen the activity on Twitter and other social media talking about states allying to coordinate during the COVID kind of relief process and reopening the economy? Is that a potential move in that direction where like states coordinating and starting to create their own institutions within within the realm of regional concerns as being a kind of move from a large structured federal institution to more localized influence?
I think it's plausible that it will be a move in that direction. The key thing to note here is that the United States, if you look at, the 50 or so states that it has, not counting various territories and tribal units and so on, where the tribal governments are supposed to be independent from the states in important ways and so on. Any one of them, compared to the federal government, has a minuscule fraction of wealth, GDP, or organizational capacity, right? A compact of several states can have far more power. On the other hand, though, I think the US has this very massive and strong precedent against unilateral secession. So if a US state holds a referendum and declares independence after a successful referendum, and the federal government refuses to leave, well, the state is not really independent, is it? Right? As long as the military doesn't leave. And if the state tries to make the federal government leave, the federal government steps right back in. Now, secession is an extreme state. You might think that this doesn't have consequences downstream for more normal political states, lower energy political states rather than high energy political states. But it straightforwardly does, right? This kind of capacity for political violence is unfortunately one of the main factors in shaping everyday politics, right? There are consequences that translate from that extreme hypothetical all the way to more mundane circumstances. And one of them is that if the federal government wants to enforce a law in your territory, it will be able to enforce a law in your territory. And as a state, you can't really opt out of laws that the federal government has decided it will not allow you to opt out of. So I think that the supremacy of the federal structure won't go away, I think there is the possibility, though, that compacts of states could start functioning as bigger blocks. So if you have California plus a few more states, that's a few percentage points of the economy. Or if you have New York plus some neighboring states, that's several percentage points of the economy. And they can coordinate with each other on a sub-federal level to push acceptance, to push the federal government to accept and stamp things in various ways. In a sense, more closer to what the original idea was between states and the federal structure. But over time, the federal structure became very strong, the states became very weak. The key flaw here is that these state compacts, they're not formed on anything like the basis of popular sovereignty or popular mandate. So right now, if you told people that California is going to do things the Californian way and Texas is going to do things the Texas way, that has some weight. But if you said the West Coast is going to do things its own way, that's already weaker. And if you say the 12-state compact is going to do things its way, that just carries no weight at all, no weight in legitimacy, right? So the governors then very quickly overstep and start seeming illegitimate. There's an interesting dance here where I think that there is deferral of responsibility with regard to opening up the economy happening. So I wonder whether the governors are just being asked to be the bag holders, right? The people who, tails they lose, heads they lose, right? If they reopen the economy too late, economic damage to the state is significant. If they reopen too soon, there are a lot of people die, and it's then seen as the problem of these governors rather than the problem of the federal government as a whole. So I suspect this is it's convenient for the federal government to have the states take the fall on this one. So yeah, I would expect limited consequence. I could see, say, the West Coast states in particular having shared economic interests and persisting in collaboration past this window of the next year or two, when the COVID crisis readjusts to a new and different normal.
Excellent, thank you. Dan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Sure. Thank you for speaking with us today, Samo. I'm curious whether you see any possibilities in the near term, in the next couple of years, anywhere in the world, where an alliance between sympathetic forces in state institutions or the bureaucracy and a movement of grassroots participatory democracy movements could form new institutions which shift the political, realistically shift the political economy of a state. And historically, what are the closest analogs, if any?
Yeah, I think that there's always the potential for this, right? The key potential here is there is a massive amount of legitimacy that, genuine widespread consciousness or grassroots support offers. It just doesn't build that much. So it legitimizes a lot, but it in itself does not build that much, because the sort of like machinery of a new structure is very intricate and it's very difficult to translate into a slogan shouted in the streets. I think that the Yellow Jackets in France were an interesting example of that fizzling out, where they're still protesting, were in fact protesting this whole time. The protests were quite serious, quite well organized, and the French government essentially ignored it or dispersed the protests as such. They have no strong support in the French state itself. So the result is that it's mostly fizzling out, and their complaints, they're very genuine complaints. They're real complaints about the state of France's economy, its society, how it's feeling more and more hopeless over time, but it's not being translated into something that has a powerful formula. When I look at the institutional landscape around the world, I think that I am most optimistic about reform in Spain, ironically, where Spain is both fragile and hurting very badly right now, but might have a potential for a functional rather than dysfunctional devolution. Now, a dysfunctional devolution is something like modern day Bosnia, which after the breakup of the Yugoslav federal government is internally divided into Bosnia and Herzegovina, or rather the sort of like the Serbian part and then the Croatian and Muslim part. It has duplicate structures going through the whole government, including multiple presidents, multiple police forces. And the problem is it's very much a vetocracy, right? Veto, as in everyone can block everything and then nothing can get done because everyone's blocking these choices and is rightfully suspicious of these other government entities. So that was an example of a compromise that brought peace, but was a dysfunctional compromise. And today, Bosnia is less economically developed than either Serbia or Croatia, and has higher rates of corruption and shorter lifespans and so on. If Spain acquires a federalist structure of some kind, where there's autonomous self-governance along these religious communities, national communities, they're all, they're mostly Catholic, right? So it's not the same situation as in Bosnia where the nationalities match up with the religion, right? Where, in Bosnia, if you're Orthodox, you ended up identifying as Serbian. If you were Catholic or from Catholic family, you ended up identifying as Croatian. And if you were Muslim, well, you identified as Muslim, even though that's not, a proper nationality in a classical sense. And you still were speaking, in fact, a Slavic language, and basically the same Slavic language as the Croatians and the Serbians were speaking. That's a stronger analog to, say, perhaps Northern Ireland. And what's happening in Spain is these languages are legitimately different, especially, say, the Basque language is not even a Romance language. But the reason why I expect that there might be positive potential there is because there are multiple important cities. There's not just Madrid, there's Barcelona. There are multiple different economies there, right? And once you can have a political economy that's better suited to the natural conditions of an area, and if security is not compromised, that might result in notably better government locally. So again, Spain has positive potential. I think Britain has positive potential. It's not actualizing it, but because Britain will be now forced to do something that's different than what the rest of the European Union is doing, I'm hoping it becomes more creative rather than less. So instead of converging with the US, instead of converging with Europe, it's going to look at Europe and be like, well, we're distinct. We haven't yet decided what it means to be distinct, but let's try to do a few things differently. The key reason I'm less optimistic about Britain than about Spain is that the urban centers where elites live and institutions live are more concentrated in Britain than they are in Spain. In Britain, it's basically just London. It's London and the rest. Well, whenever it's X and the rest, it means the rest are an amalgamation and don't necessarily have common interests or common resources or common organization or common social circles to be able to pull their own weight. No, let's say pull their own side of the tug of war. That's better, because pull their own weight already implies this strange sort of economic self-sufficiency that's not clear that exists anywhere today. I'm also optimistic about the long-term trajectory of Poland. Though I'm not sure whether I think that's a state that's becoming a highly functional centralized state. Though again, it has some possibility of multiple large cities. So if I were to look around the world beyond Europe, I think in the US, I'm not seeing that much evidence of like governmental reform in the near future, or even populist movements that could have any sort of impact, or popular movements. I think there is some possibility for positive change in South Asia in particular, and Southeast Asia. I suspect that there is positive change possibly open even in a place like Hong Kong, despite everything. I do think that in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, the status quo is preserved, and the status quo allows for some local government. And as the rest of China becomes wealthier, if Hong Kong wishes to remain distinct but still part of China, it has to find something structurally different from what it's offering now. And there was a lot of energy there, but very little institutional support, right? But the energy was definitely there for something different. Now, I'm not condoning or condemning anything that happened in the protests. I'm just noting the raw energy level or the energy level is best thought of as a function of a politically engaged populace plus grassroots organizing plus the resources to enable grassroots organizing. So that's kind of what generated this list. So Spain, Britain, maybe Hong Kong, maybe Poland, though Poland seems more functional centralized rather than functional decentralized. I think that if there were more of a civil society in Saudi Arabia, that could actually become a very interesting society post-oil, but I don't think it will be. So all of these interesting governance experiments where possibly you could see a different political economy emerge, I'm already presuming they have to be rich. And I'm presuming they have to be rich, or at least be large, if not rich, in order to not be immediately integrated into whatever new system exists locally, right? If you're experimenting with a different socioeconomic stack, it has to have the economies of scale to at least be capable of being a viable alternative to whatever the prevailing paradigm is. Now, whether it's like, Chinese capitalism or European style welfare market stuff or American style welfare market capitalism stuff, it has to be large enough to stand on its own, because otherwise those countries will use economic weight to terraform you to be more similar to themselves. So why would a strong, economically powerful trade partner want to change your political culture and your political economy to be more similar to its own? Well, so that its elites feel more comfortable doing business in your country. Like, that's been one of the big stories of human history, I think. If you have any follow-up questions, I think you asked a great question. I hope I managed to answer it.
No, you did a great job. And I guess just to carry on with what you were saying, you have to be large enough. I guess one of the models that was quite unusual is the Rojava movement, I guess, in the Kurds, that they were trying to do this libertarian socialist sort of democratic confederalism with citizen assemblies and people's assemblies and stuff like that. And they've been kind of an inspiration for a lot of, the Ignados in Spain and many of these movements around the world. And I'm guessing they don't have a lot of potential because they don't have that much weight. So they get influenced too much by the forces around them. Is that your analysis there?
Yeah, and note that for the Kurds themselves, while they have impressive organization, impressive military capacity, a very good method of using the oil money to generate some prosperity, they managed to go as far as they could because of a geopolitical circumstance, right? Of a collapsing Iraq, of a failing Syria, that was pushed by the US as well. And they have very potent enemies, right? They haven't made much progress in, say, Turkey, even though arguably Kurds are the most oppressed in Turkey, right? ISIS was worse than that, but Turkey is definitely worse than, say, the secular Syrian government or the current setup in Iraq, or even their situation in Iran, honestly. The Kurdish Workers' Party and so on and stuff like that. So there are geopolitical circumstances where you can exist on the border of multiple systems. Arguably, Singapore's initial prosperity and viability as a city-state in an era of industrial titans, only happened, this was the 20th century, right? Like the Soviet Union, China, the United States, these are industrial behemoths. These are like the kind of, leviathans that won World War II or lost World War II, right? Some of them lost, some of them won. These are not city-states, and Singapore could exist because of the Cold War. I'm just going to propose that it would not have developed as an independent fragment. And even then, Singapore is built deeply so to be compatible with the Anglosphere and Anglosphere commercial and cultural norms, even if it takes its own political approach. It's again like this kind of very civil service, very executive branch oriented city government. So yeah, that's what I would say. You can actually have a smaller or poorer country succeed at this, but they have to have very favorable geopolitical conditions where the great powers are balanced against each other in some way. So in a way, we're returning to a multipolar world with China and the US. Like, China and the US will remain the world's #1 and #2 economy probably for the rest of my life. So this actually means that on the border between the two and their spheres of influence, that's where I would also look for interesting experiments in new political economies and governments. Not because they're strong enough to challenge either China or the US or to rebuff all their influence, but because they can balance them in such a way that local uniqueness persists and can be even further developed to new prosperity or better ecological balance or more social cohesion or higher happiness, honestly. Like, these are goals beyond just the economic ones. It's just that some size of economy is in an industrial era necessary to maintain independence. I'm not saying that the economic growth is in itself an end to itself.
Thank you very much.
I'm very happy to take more questions.
I want to encourage people to ask questions. And I think something that's showing up in what you're talking about and seems to be a theme within a lot of your work is how different institutions operate at different scales. And if so, I mean, I think my question is, like, what is the role of scale in the ability for institutions to change over time and become more regionally effective?
I think scale is always a matter of, well, there's a very serious principle that's also a little bit of a joke, that people are always promoted to the level of their incompetence. I think institutions always scale beyond where they work best. They overshoot, right? So the largest extent of the Roman Empire isn't when the Roman Empire is working best. It's when all of the investments from when it was working best come in, when that harvest is in of that seed corn that was planted long ago. And I think the same happened with the US. I don't think the US worked the best ever in 1991, but 1991 was probably the zenith of its global influence. And then similarly, I think for non-state organizations such as the Catholic Church, if we're talking about large-scale stuff, it's like, 1 billion believers, at least in theory, and representatives everywhere, and almost para-states status, right? Observers in the United Nations with embassies around the world, the ability to set their own laws and all of that. Arguably overshooting what is optimally needed for the preservation of a particular religious teaching. So I think it's often the case that as you scale from individual to small group, to distributed group, to hierarchical group, to coalitions of hierarchical or distributed groups, to coalitions of those, to systems and coordination protocols at the final level, when there's not even any organizational connection, it's just an alliance of organizations, individuals that do things the same way, the right way, and are self-reflectively, collaborating on extending that terraforming process on the world. There is a way in which the later stages harness the previous stages, right? So the resources that are accumulated by a previous stage might then be used by a different or new stage of social technology. So the kind of accumulation you might see arising out of a priestly class in the ancient agricultural world might then be used to fund an army or build walls around the temple and some other residential areas. And then suddenly what used to be this kind of religious ceremonial site has acquired the capital that is used by a different social system, an army and movement of people control type, so a walled city-state. And that's sort of the Sumerian city-state. It's clearly a transition from one form to another that retains the previous form, where the previous form enabled the kind of material and social accumulation that were the starting capital, in a way, of the next one. And I think something very similar happened with the modern state, where the initial impetus for the modern state was this, absolutist monarchies of the 17th and 18th century, where they wanted to firmly get in control of any sort of powerful local feudal powers that might have remained. And they partnered up with a rising middle class because they figured out how to tax a rising middle class, a rising bourgeois class in the Industrial Revolution. But then eventually the absolute monarchy part of that big structure became obsolete and was just replaced and axed, right? And in many cases, literally guillotined, right? So there is there is an interesting way in which social technologies can lead to their own opposites if they produce the material and social preconditions for their successor, and if, so there's another if there, if the new structure has an active interest in delegitimizing the old one rather than amalgamating with it. This is perhaps still like relatively abstract, but I would say that the coordination of people and large numbers of people to do certain things or to not do certain things is like the central challenge of history almost. And we can look at history as the unfolding of different kinds of social technology that are actually prerequisites for material technology. You know, I think there is a big difference between Heron steam engine and Watt steam engine in engineering. Heron living in ancient Alexandria in ancient Greece, ancient Alexandria in the ancient Greek world. It's what today would be Egypt, obviously. And James Watt, you know, living in Britain in this period of the 17th, the 18th century, 19th century. But the biggest difference, honestly, is that there is a economic use for the steam engine, right? There's not like it has to compete with relatively abundant and cheap human labor. It's actually the case that, you know, there is no disposable human labor, at least in that part of Britain itself. The workers, sure, but there are no slaves. So I think many material technologies actually have hidden social technology prerequisites. And I think the material artifacts are visible, you know, so the Roman aqueducts are far more visible than the culture that was needed to have large urban populations, because without large urban populations, there's no need to deliver that quantity of water, hence no reason to maintain the aqueducts. And similarly, when we look at these artifacts of modern industrial society, I don't, you know, a jet engine or a rocket or a computer, I don't think we actually fully understand all the social technologies in this stack. I think we're not fully self-aware as a civilization. I think we don't fully understand how we work. So I think political science, economics, anthropology, all of this has been insufficient to describe to ourselves what we are. And that might even be in principle impossible, because if a society, you know, if bodies of knowledge in a society fully understand what the society is, its society reflecting on itself, it's already become something more complex just through the process of reflecting on itself.
Wow, thank you. I have a question that I was asked to read out for you. So this is from Ernesto. Thank you for your question. What is the solution for minimizing corruption in governance? And what is the most effective way to implement transparency and accountability?
It's a difficult question. I think there's no universal answer. I think it really depends strongly on local incentives. It's very interesting that I think that individual accountability plays a significant role, but bureaucrats are always very good at shielding themselves from individual accountability. I think a preference for overt action rather than covert action is perhaps best. So in an interesting and paradoxical way, having maximally idealist views of what is legitimate government. So if as a society you have maximally idealist views as to what is a legitimate government, then you are incentivizing the government to hide anything that's less than ideal. So in an interesting way, you are demanding to be lied to, and it's fairly easy to lie to the population, unfortunately, right? That's one of the big problems, I think, with 19th and 20th century government, is that it's possible to manage public opinion. Sometimes it's easier to manage public opinion than it is to manage physical reality, right? It's easier for China perhaps to censor the outcome of an earthquake in a region rather than admit that, you know, emergency responses were bad and that the construction codes were shoddy and that actually there were a bunch of casualties. This happened a few years ago. I forget which Chinese province, but the best estimates we have suggest notably higher death toll than what was reported domestically. Still, from the perspective of, you know, 950 million Chinese who were not in that one province, that 50 or maybe 5 million people province, that's a completely plausible story, and that's just the truth of how things are. So I think that a culture that understands the imperfection of government and a culture that values personal integrity and selects actively for people will succeed at this profession and accrue rewards if they have personal integrity and intend to communicate to the public. I think that's a fairly strong combination, and it's can be implemented in many different ways and in different cultural contexts, right? If I wanted to push more towards honest government in, let's call it, let's say 17th century Germany, appealing to Christian virtues of the rulers might not be too terrible a stratagem, because a lot of them were probably personally believing Christians who were tactically avoiding in their own awareness how the reality of their government is incompatible with the principles they believe every Sunday when they're at Mass. And then as long as this doesn't cause the elite as a whole to be less Christian in that context, that's positive. Now, if you try to espouse Christian values in the US today, I don't think that necessarily results in a better government. So that's just an illustration, not pro or anti-Christianity, just an illustration of how situationally dependent the answer to that question is, right? Like in an interesting way, this the perspective that the government is mostly a reflection of processes might lead to better outcomes somewhat. People might focus on processes somewhat more. They might think less of personalities and more of organizations. On the other side though, it's very easy to hide something through obscurity. So in order to make a government transparent, you have to make it comprehensible. To make it comprehensible, it has to be relatively simple. To have it be relatively simple and not merely pretending to be relatively simple, then it has to be both simple and quite effective. Otherwise, it'll be a complex beast pretending to be simple, giving you like a false, almost simulation of how your government works. I also think that day-to-day oversight of the government is very difficult, but I do think that you can have societies where people have enough socioeconomic leisure that they can in broad strokes check into the functioning of government, say once every few years or once every year. You need then a culture where people are not following a 24-hour news cycle, but are instead reading books, and they have, just as a normal middle-class person, you might have a strong interest in the functioning and activities of the IRS. It's not that everyone would check into the IRS or check into the FDA. It's that enough people check into the FDA and talk about it and have social circles around it and have a secure enough job that they can afford books about it or can afford travel. And it's considered acceptable for them to literally email in with questions or Freedom of Information Act requests. And that then produces a demand for something that's notably more difficult to fake, right? And I think that this direct, casual culture of citizen interest in the true fundamentals of government and governance is very tricky and difficult to maintain. I think we don't have it because it very naturally gets displaced by debates about personality and debates about the news cycle. And the news cycle chains you to a memory that from a historical perspective might as well be goldfish memory. You don't remember what happened 3 months ago. Like to the first approximation, I think people do not remember what was politically relevant 3 months ago. And that's really, it's terrible, right? So to try to restate everything I've said in like a neat, concise part, government has to be relatively simple. It has to be incentivized towards honesty, and the personal social incentives of the people in government have to be aligned with this institutional incentive of honesty. And finally, there has to be enough of a leisure class that people just as a hobby go and think about institutions and then talk about it relatively freely. And then this can be implemented in many different ways.
Great, excellent question. As a follow-up to that, do you think that something like a debt jubilee or UBI might create the possibility for a leisure class to emerge within like a complex society like the United States that would maybe create the possibility for a citizen kind of interest in the functioning of governance that might create a new incentive structure?
Yeah, I think that a debt jubilee is the better approach because I think UBI is something that it's very expensive to be poor. So if you give the poor more money on their bank account, it helps them as individuals, but over time it just incentivizes everyone to make it even more expensive to be poor. So in a weird way, if say you are living in San Francisco and there's massive demand to live in San Francisco, and you've added to everyone's bank accounts $1,000 a month, for example, it just means the rents go up in San Francisco. It doesn't actually help anyone live in San Francisco and access the economic activities of San Francisco. Now, on the margin, this might not be true of a city where the supply of housing and the demand for housing are more balanced. And I also think that the health costs would arise to take advantage of this. Because currently, I think I'm grossly simplifying, so please forgive this gross simplification. The healthcare system in the US legally obliges various private entities to take care of the poor. So if you give the poor more money, well, they're just going to charge them more. They're legally obliged to provide them service whether or not they're charging them more. And that can eat up a significant chunk of the UBI as well. Meanwhile, debt on the other hand is much better because in the US there's an unacknowledged social control structure, called your credit score. It's a credit score. It's not a social credit score, but it might as well be. It's certainly influenced by everything you read online because your data is sold around promiscuously, right? What you're buying on Amazon is like information that's sold everywhere, and also factors into this mysterious stuff that feeds into, your credit ratings and so on. And the credit ratings influence where you can live. And currently, I think the job opportunities for the few remaining upwardly mobile, or at least jobs that don't necessitate downward mobility, those few jobs are super geographically gated. They only exist in something like 20 or 30 American cities. So even for generous, include the second tier cities, right? Like Austin or Seattle. So I'm not even talking here about San Francisco and New York. I don't think there's much happening out of the top 30 or 40 cities in the US. So you might then alleviate the plight of people who are healthy, but are primarily held down by rent. I think that's what UBI achieves. But you don't alleviate the plight of the old, the very young, people who want to have children, people with medical conditions, people with, frankly, also addictions, mental health issues, right? Like the social disaster related to the opioid crisis and basically casual use of uppers and downers in all parts of American society to manage mood, either legal or illegal. So here I'm not actually making a distinction between Adderall and weed, or weed and heroin, or alcohol or tobacco and all of this. It's just the fact that people are using a lot of their discretionary spending to regulate their own mood. And this sometimes produces addictions, which are complex social and biological phenomena. So it's not really that straightforward. And these addictions then produce health side effects, which need to be treated, which are super expensive to treat. So I think it produces then a class of people who are young, relatively healthy, not depressed, who couldn't afford rent in a third tier city, who can now afford rent in a third tier city. I think that's insufficient to be a leisure class at a high enough level of education. On the other end, though, debt jubilee can prevent people from being downwardly mobile and can also help people at least have more shots at something like a good life. In particular, I would be bullish for the following proposal: a full jubilee on student debt, just full cancellation of student debt. And if you have to confiscate some endowments just to make it sure that the universities don't just double down and continue gobbling up all the money, that seems fine to me. And this is in a class of people that has tried to educate themselves, and they were either helped or not helped by the universities, and they suddenly find themselves free again. So that I would think is the best single intervention I can think of in that space for having there be a leisure class that can reflect on society.
Great. And Dan, would you like to ask your follow-up question?
Yeah, sure. Some of it was, I guess, answered there. So I guess in addition to a debt jubilee, and I think there's some issues with the UBI. It's just insufficient. I agree with you. It's really only
It's eaten up by the other systems, is my point, right?
Yeah, it needs other things, and it perhaps needs more stuff. Let's see, I had my question up there. Okay, there it is. Yeah, so what about, as far as increasing the size of this leisure class? I have some issues with the term leisure, because there was, I forget who wrote it, there was a book written in the late 19th century about the leisure class, and it's so
that uses in a different term. I kind of use it more in the Aristotelian sense of leisure.
Okay, yeah, because he's using it more in this elitist, like the leisure class is the elitist class, and the power elite class.
I'm just proposing you have unstructured time to pursue on your own initiative and interest intellectual and physical self-perfection and improvement.
Right. Let's take the Aristotelian model, which I'm far more Greek than I am, in philosophy than I am in that other sense. So I guess that whole funding, how do you financially support people as we're moving into this automated workplace, where the whole goal of automation is to get rid of people, right? So that's a problem we have to face. But citizens' assemblies based on sortition, I think, is a very key part, I think, in building up this Aristotelian leisure class, because people would be motivated to educate themselves, and they would have power. People would be chosen by jury from the populace to actually debate and discuss over issues and actually pass real legislation. I think that's part of creating this leisure class. I'd like to know your point of view on that, and I'd also like to know what other ideas, policies, or practices or institutions you think would help to strengthen and broaden this leisure class that we're speaking of here.
Yeah, I think that I'm assuming that for the purpose of government oversight was the initial notion, where it's enough to have many people looking at different aspects of government and actually understanding them, ideally participating in them. Doesn't require absolutely everyone to do this. It's of course positive if absolutely everyone can have leisure, but just from a structural perspective, it's not actually it's not a necessity for that goal. The previous one describing like institutional excellence. I do think that the positive role of time of play or time of education and so on, interspersed with civic activity, is very close to, say, the ideal of otium, which was a term that the Romans used for this kind of leisure, which was the idea that you have the opportunity to both retreat from society and then return to participating in society. Because by retreating from society, you have time to reflect on your own social environment, you have time to read books and so on. So it's not just that I'm not obliged to go to work, it's I can in fact take a break from my normal social responsibilities. But also I can return to my previous social responsibility at about the level of authority that I had previously. There's a small element of this preserved in the academic sabbatical, right? Imagine if you could take economic or social sabbaticals in any position in society. That would be very interesting. There's certainly dysfunctional variants of that one could implement, but I also suspect, very functional ones that would be difficult to abuse or would be abused in economically relevant ways that on the margin, it doesn't really matter if we, aren't really indulging them directly. Now, I think here's my contrarian position. A lot of people imagine that in the future, the robots do all the work and automation has fully replaced people. I think we are farther away from that than we would like to imagine. Here, I would cite a paper by Robin Hanson, and unfortunately I forget his co-author, on the spread of automation, where it behaves much more like a colonization wave, in the sense that the areas that are best automated are the areas that are economically right adjacent to an already automated system. So it's not like automation goes into areas that were not automated at all and wipes out everyone. It's more like automation, like incrementally spreads, like say like fungal growth or like plant growth right next to areas that are already automated. The reason is it's much easier to teach machines how to work with machines than it is to teach machines how to work with people, or teach people how to work with machines, right? So I think that's the underlying really basic reason, and why I say, you know, a lot of people who liked Andrew Yang, they thought we were living in a totally different world where robots are popping up in fields that had never received any automation, rather than there's an incremental advance of that frontier. We have to actually figure out what are people extremely good at, because I don't really think there is a social structure or a social technology that would allow us to reliably protect the rights and reliably keep decision relevant humans if humans have no irreplaceable function in it. So as soon as you can replace a human, the political temptation exists to remove the human. So if we find what people in particular, what humans are very good at, then the leisure time to perfect that becomes an investment rather than a drain in the system. And then it becomes politically harmful, not because you're like, so, you know, you're not keeping them leisured because you're so idealistic. You're keeping them leisured because you have no choice but to keep them leisured, or spending otium, right? Otium in this way, because they actually are just formidable enough to deny you this structurally important role in society. And here's another one. Here's an interesting one. I would propose we are nowhere near the optimal economic use of human beings, and that we have, in fact, in many ways, intentionally made them less useful and are relying on less efficient systems, right? So, you know, I think if we examine the physical capabilities of humans, or the mental capabilities of humans in particular here, there are many things we could be doing with a different social structure that would generate vast wealth or vast, like, you know, knowledge value that we are not. No one is going to convince me that the debt system is the correct way for us to deal with our most educated class of people, where I actually view it as a control mechanism. You know, at first, we don't let the masses into the universities. Now we let the masses into the universities. But there's a trick. You're now indebted, so you're still not free, right? So I think that actually was an adaptive cybernetic response from the system, shutting out this larger crowd of people from being necessary, because if you make them necessary, then they're decision relevant, right? So I hope this was not too vague. I actually am speaking fairly precisely here. So whenever I hear people propose, oh, with advancements in technology, people won't be needed for the economy, therefore we might as well treat them nicely. I think we won't treat them nicely if they're not necessary for the economy. I think if you look at our economy, we only treat nicely the people who are absolutely irreplaceable. It's not like, you know, it's not like people really adore programmers as people right now or admire them that deeply. It's just that they happen to be economically irreplaceable, so they are paid well. Though the cities they live in are still kind of like not great.
True, but you're making a certain assumption in your analysis that we're sticking with the same neoclassical, neoliberal ideology.
Oh, I'm going to say it's beyond neoclassical and neoliberal. You do have equivalent things to this in, say, the feudal system, right? So, like what I'm saying here, it's more like realpolitik, rather than assuming that the competition is baked in. It's more that if you want a non-competitive or a different system, it just has to be politically more robust than the current one. It's like the current one that has to crumble away, and yours is like winning on its own strengths, right? And I hope the point I'm making about the feudal system is like not that the feudal system is amazing or even better than the current one in that regard. I'm just saying that that system would also, the logic also applies to that system, not just this one. So I'm proposing this is like there's like a selection mechanism that's kind of happening on the meta level with the different social technologies at play in the world. And if you actually need something that's way better, not necessarily at strict material accumulation, but at least rapid institutional adjustment.
Excellent, thank you. Well,
okay, that really went into it, but I don't get many opportunities to answer that question, so I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, That was great. So it is 2, and so I want to take note of the time, but we do have an excellent question in the chat, so I wanted to invite you to answer that question if you have the time. If not, that's totally fine, and we can wrap up. So up to you.
I'd be happy to answer one more.
Excellent. So Nathan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. Thank you, Samo, for taking my question. So the increasing role of the judiciary, which you mentioned in creating law, isn't limited to the US. You've got the Strasbourg Court, or the ECHR, which has had significant influence in law even in illiberal countries like Turkey and Russia. And similarly, Israel had a judicial revolution in the early 90s,
Yes.
which led to the High Court becoming, in effect, Israel's second legislative chamber. Israel is formally unicameral, but the High Court acts as a check on a check and balance. Do you see these developments as endogenous to the territories in question? Do they originate from American influence, or do international institutions have independent power to influence systems of government in this way? And what does this mean for countries like Hungary and Israel, where there is a constituency to remove or to sidestep this judicial legislative power? Will the main difficulties come from the internal elites, from great powers, or from some form of internationalism?
I think it comes out of the answer is mixed. Some of these are, in fact, straightforwardly things that are a reflection of current international elites or current dominant US influence. Say in the Hungary example, I think the growth of judiciary, which has now been, I think, significantly curtailed recently, was mostly an externally driven phenomena. In Israel, I think it was mostly an internally driven phenomena. If you have a society that's very high in law, where people have a lot of trust in law, but little trust in politicians, then judges will over time slowly morph into politicians, because they will be executing political stuff under the rubric of neutral, impartial interpretation of the law. In America, I think we've gone very far in the direction of the Supreme Court positions are just considered political positions. Like the party affiliation of the judges is considered the absolutely crucial thing. People debate the composition of the Supreme Court, much as people might have debated the composition of Congress in 1850, right? So I think in that way, over time, this will diminish the reputation of law as such, because people will come to see law as no longer the semi-objective thing, neutral thing, technocratic thing, and see it as more tactical, as more opportunistic. So I think even within the international system, centered on the United States and these like institutions, that's going to happen. I think that the court, the Strasbourg court is, and the European courts are a very good and positive example overall, but in a way they're relying on a reservoir of like liberal thinking in Europe. So they're not adding to liberal thinking in Europe, but they're on the basis of this liberal thinking, liberal norms, institutions, exporting the effects to places like Turkey, right? So it's, I think, important to see what's powering the process and what's merely a distribution channel. So I think of them as an important distribution channel, but it's once the power plant is off, like once the power plant stops operating, all the lights in the town will go out. So I don't think it's permanently altering the societies, right? And I think, you know, in Israel, my prediction is in Israel, actually, the court will be fairly robust, because I think the intellectual level of argumentation in the court is extremely high. I think in Europe, it will remain robust, but will decrease in international prestige as the prestige of Europe decreases. And in the United States, I'm not sure whether the Supreme Court will remain robust. Like we're talking about over a 30-year time period, right? So I'm not expecting anything weird next year, but like, again, like this stuff changes very quickly. FDR threatened to pack the Supreme Court back in the day. This could easily be done by a different president. There's like no limit on how many people you can add to the Supreme Court. So if I press a little button and increase the size of America's Supreme Court to 50 judges, I've actually made it less powerful, because their ability to coordinate with each other is diminished, and the power of external stakeholders to come into it and internally divide it has increased. I also think it can't possibly handle the load of all the laws that have to be taken. So a lot of them just fall down to bureaucratic implementation instead of even a court decision, let alone a legislature decision. Thank you very much for your question. It was very interesting. And
Thank you.
yeah, and Raven, thank you very much for hosting. I really enjoyed this, and thank you to everyone who participated and asked questions. Dan, I really enjoyed talking to you about some of the topics you raised as well.
Yeah, thank you, Samo, for coming. It's been so generative to have you here to talk about institutions and the viability of our civilization. So I hope to have you back here at the STOA, and thank you everybody for your excellent questions. I'm just going to let everyone know that we have a couple events coming up tomorrow. We have collective presencing, a practice with Ria Beck at noon. We have swimming in the digital during a pandemic with Alexander Bard, the infamous philosopher, at 2:30. And then we have Socratic speed dating with me, yours truly. I will be hosting that at 7. And then Stoic meaning wave with Akira the Dawn at 8:30. So a lot of things happening tomorrow. So please join us. And thank you all for coming out. Bye.